The story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This episode can very well either break or make this channel. We'll see. In our last episode, we saw Abraham bartering on behalf of the cities in question. And as many of you might know,
spoiler alert,
God still wipes them out. And so today we'll be looking at this story, as well as some others regarding some of Israel's neighbors. But I'd also like to put out a disclaimer on this episode. It's not particularly kid-friendly. You might ask, well, we're talking about the Bible. How could that not be family appropriate? Well, the stories that we'll hear today do regard some sexual misconduct, and it just may not be something that you want to expose the children to. I'm just putting it out there. So what are we talking about here? Well, we have some propositioning, a father trying to sell out his daughters, some incestual relations, one man giving his wife to another man, and the world's first yo mama joke. Don't say I didn't warn you. So we'll start off where we left off last time, with the two men who are with the Lord going on their way to travel down to Sodom. So for those following at home, this is chapter 19. And so let's jump right into the story. We pray that God may bless the reading of his sacred word. The two angels reached Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he got up to greet them, and bowing down with his face to the ground, he said, "Please, gentlemen, come aside into your servant's house for the night, and bathe your feet. You can get up early to continue your journey." But they replied, "No, we shall pass the night in the town square." He urged them so strongly, however, that they turned aside to his place and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking cakes without leaven, and they dined. Before they went to bed, all the townsmen of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, closed in on the house. They called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to your house tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may have intimacies with them." Lot went out to meet them at the entrance. When he had shut the door behind him, he said, "I beg you, my brothers, not to do this wicked thing. I have 2 daughters who have never had intercourse with men. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please. But don't do anything to these men, for you know they have come under the shelter of my roof." They replied, "Stand back. This fellow," they sneered, "came here as an immigrant, and now he dares to give orders? We'll treat you worse than them." With that, they pressed hard against Lot, moving in closer to break down the door. But his guests put out their hands, pulled Lot inside with them, and closed the door. At the same time, they struck the men at the entrance of the house, one and all, with such a blinding light that they were utterly unable to reach the doorway. Then the angel said to Lot, "Who else belongs to you here? Your sons, sons-in-law, and your daughters, and all who belong to you in the city. Take them away from it. We are about to destroy this place, for the outcry reaching the Lord against those in the city is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had contracted marriage with his daughters. "Get up and leave this place," he told them. "The Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. As dawn was breaking, the angels urged Lot on, saying, "On your way, take with you your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." When he hesitated, the men, by the Lord's mercy, seized his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters, and led them to safety outside the city. As soon as they had been brought outside, he was told, "Flee for your life. Don't look back or stop anywhere on the plain. Get off to the hills at once, or you will be swept away." "Oh no, my lord," replied Lot. "You have already thought enough of your servant to do me the great kindness of intervening to save my life. But I cannot flee to the hills to keep the disaster from overtaking me, and so I shall die. Look, this town ahead is near enough to escape to. It's only a small place. Let me flee there. It's a small place, isn't it? That my life may be saved?" "Well then," he replied, "I will also grant you the favor you now ask. I will not overthrow the town you speak of. Hurry, escape there. I cannot do anything until you arrive there. That is why the town is called Zoar." The sun was just rising over the earth as Lot arrived in Zoar. At the same time, the Lord rained down sulphurous fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of heaven. He overthrew those cities and the whole plain, together with the inhabitants of the cities and the produce of the soil. But Lot's wife looked back and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Early the next morning, Abraham went to the place where he had stood in the Lord's presence. As he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole region of the plain, he saw dense smoke over the land rising like fumes from a furnace. Thus it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he was mindful of Abraham by sending Lot away from the upheaval by which God overthrew the cities where Lot had been living. The first sentence in this narrative already has a lot of information and is worth looking at. The two men are indeed malachim, or messengers in Hebrew, or in Greek they would be angelos, where we get the word angels. And of course in the Bible they would have just looked like attractive men.
Your friends are with you, Aragorn.
I mean, based on the reactions of the townspeople. And so they encounter Lot sitting at the city gates. Now, to be seated at the city gates had a very specific meaning in the ancient world. He was not just hanging out there the way Abraham was in front of his tent, but the elders of the city acted as judges and would meet there at the city gates to barter deals or make judgment on particular important decisions. And so Lot would have had this position, which is interesting and means that he probably had to give enough money to the right people, if you get my meaning, to be in such a position. And so he is out there seated as a judge in the city. And now this is in direct contrast to God, who Abraham in the last chapter called the judge of the world. And so we see how this particular action goes as he greets these two angels. And the next few lines allow us to continue to compare and contrast these two stories. Like Abraham, Lot does offer his guests hospitality by offering to wash their feet, prepare them a meal, and even invites them to stay at his house. And now as they went through town, apparently they attracted the attention of a number of people in the town. And the text tells us that everyone in the city came to the door. It does sound like a bit of hyperbole, or kind of sounds like how my children might say it was literally everyone in the city. And in the Hebrew, it sounds like it was both the men and the women. Everyone came to the door. And this parallels actually the conversation that Abraham had with God, in which he said that the wickedness is of all the people in the city. And when they approach Lot, it is clear that many of them, including, if not primarily the men, want to have intimacies with Lot's guests. And this is, of course, where we get the word sodomy from. And this, for many, has been an interpretation of the great sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. But was this the sole reason that these two cities were destroyed? Of course, context is very important. And as we will see, this is the first of 3 stories that deal with sexual impropriety. It also comes on the heels of the love story between Abraham and Sarah when they receive news of their long-expected child. In this particular story, we also see that Lot himself is not innocent, as he tries to give out his daughters to these men instead of the guests that he has. And in doing so, he invokes the name of hospitality, this being an important virtue in the Near East. And his guests, of course, throw it right back at him and say that how dare he talk to them, being an immigrant himself in the city. And so many scholars feel that this was another one of the great sins of the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, was their lack of hospitality, and that they did not respect this virtue. It was particularly in the way that they treated others, and they treated the guests of Lot. And this is not just a modern concept. When Sodom and Gomorrah are mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, various aspects of their wickedness are detailed, but those that seem to prevail are their inhospitable and unjust treatment of others. In Isaiah 1 and 3 and Ezekiel 16, they are condemned for their wealth and mistreatment of the poor, actions which go against hospitality for the stranger and the immigrant among them. What is even more telling is the association Jesus makes with Sodom and Gomorrah in Matthew's Gospel. In chapter 10, when commissioning his apostles to go forth and preach his word, Jesus tells them to shake the dust from their feet if they are not welcomed and listened to. He then adds that it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. Jesus is speaking about hospitality as well as an openness to the gospel. So yes, while this unwanted sexual advances were used to illustrate their wickedness, the great sin of the city could be seen as the overall inhospitable treatment to others, in whatever form it takes. So let's return to the narrative. To further prove this point, the townspeople throw it in Lot's face that he is an immigrant and has no place to refuse the request. Then the angels grab him and blast the men outside with a blinding light. So it appears that angels also have superpowers, and of course it would be a weapon of light. And they do tell Lot to grab his family and flee the city. And of course his family would be him and his wife, his 2 daughters, and his future son-in-laws. It seems that they were betrothed but not yet married, where it says his daughters were still virgins. Now, even then, Lot is hesitant, and he doesn't even want to go far from the city, thinking that it won't be that bad. And so the angel allows him to settle in that small town called Zoar. The name itself means, I think, little place. And so that's where the angels bring him as the city is destroyed. We're also told that Lot is saved primarily because of his uncles pleading for him. Of course, to be more precise, it was Lot and his daughters who were saved. The boyfriends didn't make it out because they didn't believe what the angels were saying. And Lot's wife turned around, even though she was told not to, and was turned into a pillar of salt. Both these situations are interpreted as being the other's lack of faith in what was happening, the lack or the inability to trust in God. Now, when the cities were destroyed, it's described as fire from heaven, but also that they were overturned or upturned. And so many scholars believe that an earthquake accompanied the destruction of the cities, and the bitumen or petroleum in the mines would have ignited, which would have caused such a fiery spectacle as well. Now, the site of the cities of the plain where Sodom and Gomorrah used to be are now called the Dead Sea. And if you ever visit, you'll see a desolate body of water where nothing lives, smelling of sulfur and surrounded by salt formations and pieces of asphalt or hardened bitumen. So the next short story gives a little bit of history about what will happen to Lot and his daughters, who will settle east of Jordan and the Dead Sea. Now, be warned, these are rivals to Israel at this point, and it is not a flattering story. Since Lot was afraid to stay in Zoar, he and his 2 daughters went up from Zoar and settled in the hill country, where he lived with his 2 daughters in a cave. The older one said to the younger, "Our father is getting old, and there is not a man on earth to unite with us, as was the custom everywhere. Come, let us ply our father with wine, and then lie with him, that we may have offspring by our father." So that night they plied their father with wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father. But he was not aware of her lying down or her getting up. Next day, the older one said to the younger, "Last night it was I who lay with my father. Let us ply him with wine again tonight, and then you go in and lie with him, that we both may have offspring by our father." So that night, too, they plied their father with wine, and then the younger one went in and lay with him. But again, he was not aware of her lying down or her getting up. Thus, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older one gave birth to a son, whom she named Moab, saying, "From my father." He is the ancestor of the Moabites of today. The younger one, too, gave birth to a son, and she named him Ammon, saying, "The son of my kin." He is the ancestor of the Ammonites today. I did warn you. This story actually has some parallels with the story of Noah and his sons, both dealing with the father passing out from wine, having his children expose his shame, and then those that did it really being separated from the rest of the nation of Israel. And yet in this story, the daughters actually sleep with their father. And so the progeny actually continues through their sin. And it is interesting that their names that are given for Moab and Ammon would have been a point of ridicule towards these nations, as we are told of the etymologies.
Hey, yo mama so.
And yes, those last 2 verses are the basis of the first yo mama jokes in the ancient world. They're basically saying, your mama was so bad that she slept with her dad. And so let's continue with one more narrative for today to round out chapter 20. And this particular story seems a little bit out of place. Not out of place for being in the Bible, but out of place chronologically. So this is the second of what are often called the sister-wife stories, and is very similar to the one we heard about Abraham and Sarah in Egypt. And it also parallels another one that we will hear in chapter 26 with Isaac and Rebekah. And many authors would point to its inclusion being the work of 2 different authors, each with a different version of the event. But let's read the story first, and then look a little bit about its meaning. Abraham journeyed on to the region of the Negeb, where he settled between Kadesh and Shur. While he stayed in Gerar, he said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she has a husband." Abimelech, who had not approached her, said, "O Lord, would you slay a man even though he is innocent? He himself told me she is my sister, and she herself also stated he is my brother. I did it in good faith and with clean hands." God answered him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did it in good faith. In fact, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Therefore, return the man's wife. As a spokesman, he will intercede for you, that your life may be saved. If you do not return her, you can be sure that you and all who are yours will certainly die." Early the next morning, Abimelech called all his court officials and informed them of everything that had happened, and the men were horrified. Then Abimelech summoned Abraham and said to him, "How could you do this to us? What wrong did I do to you that you should have brought such monstrous guilt on me and my kingdom? You have treated me in an intolerable way. What were you afraid of?" he asked him, "that you should have done such a thing?" "I was afraid," answered Abraham, "because I thought that surely there would be no fear of God in this place, and so they would kill me on account of my wife. Besides, she is in truth my sister, but only my father's daughter, not my mother's, and so she became my wife. When God sent me wandering from my father's house, I asked her, 'Would you do me this favor? In whatever place we come, say that I am your brother.' Then Abimelech took flocks and herds and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And after he restored his wife Sarah to him, he said, 'Here, my land lies at your disposal. Settle wherever you please.' To Sarah he said, 'See, I have given your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. Let that serve you as a vindication before all who are with you. Your honor has been preserved with everyone.' Abraham then interceded with God, and God restored health to Abimelech, that is, to his wife and his maidservants, so that they could bear children. For God had tightly closed every womb in Abimelech's household on account of Abraham's wife, Sarah." It seems fairly obvious that this story would not have taken place after the previous chapters. For one, Abraham and Sarah have already settled in Canaan, and so it is unlikely that they would have been traveling. Also, Sarah is in her 90s and expecting a child, which would make this story even less likely. And it would reverse all of the development that Abraham and Sarah have experienced, especially that we saw in the last chapter where they were entertaining God and his angels. And so how might we see this story? One way would be to see it as a type of flashback. After hearing these stories of the sexual improprieties of the neighboring nations, we are reminded that Abraham himself is not innocent in this regard. He too lacked faith in God, and he put others in danger by his selfishness and disrespect for his wife. And so let's look at the story again because it does offer some unique details. King Abimelech is introduced here, and we'll hear more about him in later chapters. But when he takes Sarah, God appears to him in a dream to protect him and also to protect Sarah. And it shows that God, in fact, does not punish the innocent with the guilty. As when he confronts Abraham, it really shows that Abraham is indeed the guilty party in this situation, and his excuse was not sufficient. There's also a translation of some Hebrew words in this section that are worth exploring. In verse 7, God refers to Abraham as a nabi, which is translated as prophet. Modern English usage often understands a prophet as someone who predicts the future, but this was not the Hebrew understanding. A prophet referred to a spokesperson, so a prophet of God was someone who spoke on behalf of the Lord and in turn could intercede with God on behalf of the people. Abraham demonstrated this when he interceded for the people of Sodom. Also, in trying to justify himself, Abraham says that he thought there would be no fear of God in this place. The expression here is yirat Yahweh, which means to revere the Lord. It speaks more to the act of honoring God with prayer and obedience. The expression fear of the Lord will be seen throughout the Bible and shows a sense of reverence rather than being afraid. Because Abimelech was the king of a polytheistic people, Abraham assumed that he would not have fear of the God, that he would not respect his God or his traditions. Of course, he was wrong in this, and it shows that Abraham at this point in his life still had much to learn. So what do these more adult stories have to tell us in the context of Israel's history, but also for us today? First, we see that there is a lot of wickedness in the world, and God is aware of it. In the early days of the Hebrew history, we see God stepping in and punishing the evildoers all the time. But this tends to get lessened as we continue throughout the Bible. By the time of Jesus, we are told that the good and the bad are allowed to grow together, like the wheat and the weeds, until the final harvest. Just as in the first story of creation, the light and darkness both remain. It is easy to get caught up in trying to identify the greatest sins of others and making ourselves the judge. Often the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been used to condemn or persecute those who are gay, or any of those within the LGBTQ community. But the scripture certainly does not justify that. Judgment belongs to God alone, and perhaps our role is more like that of Abraham, who intercedes on behalf of others. As we saw with the last story we read, like Abraham, we most likely are not innocent ourselves, and certainly would not want to be defined by our sin. Instead, we might want to be defined by our hospitality, and be remembered for the way in which we treated our neighbors. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I do hope that you found this to be inspiring. Please feel free to comment below, and due to the content of this episode, I do remind you to be courteous and respectful of everyone. And I look forward to next time we hear about the long-awaited birth of Isaac. Until then, be hospitable and do good.